The connection between Saudi Arabia and terrorism runs deeper than 9/11. It's a complex and often contradictory relationship marked by both cooperation and complicity. To understand this connection, we must look beyond the surface. We must delve into the history, the ideology, and the shadowy networks that have fueled extremism for decades. Saudi Arabia is the birthplace of Islam. It's also home to Wahhabism, an ultra-conservative interpretation of the faith. Wahhabism has been the dominant form of Islam in Saudi Arabia for centuries. The world changed on September 11, 2001. The devastating attacks on American soil sent shockwaves across the globe. In the aftermath, all eyes turned to Saudi Arabia. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals. This fact alone cast a long shadow over the kingdom's reputation. Suspicions arose about Saudi Arabia's potential role in the events of that day. The Saudi government vehemently denied any involvement. However, the world was left wondering, could there be more to the story? The 9/11 attacks were a turning point. They forced the world to confront the terrifying reality of global terrorism. They also exposed the complex relationship between Saudi Arabia and the West. For years, the kingdom had been a key ally in the fight against extremism. Yet the nationality of the hijackers raised uncomfortable questions. Could a country so closely aligned with the West also be connected to such a horrific act of terror? The Saudi government maintained its innocence. It condemned the attacks and pledged its support to the United States. But for many, doubts lingered. The sheer number of Saudi hijackers was difficult to ignore. It hinted at a deeper connection between the kingdom and the ideology that fueled the attacks. The world demanded answers. What was the true nature of Saudi Arabia's relationship with terrorism? The events of 9/11 sparked a global debate. Some argued that Saudi Arabia was a victim of circumstance. They pointed to the kingdom's efforts to combat terrorism within its own borders. Others, however, believed that Saudi Arabia was playing a dangerous game. They accused the kingdom of turning a blind eye to the funding and spread of extremist ideologies. The truth, as is often the case, likely lay somewhere in between. The connection between Saudi Arabia and terrorism runs deeper than 9/11. It's a complex and often contradictory relationship marked by both cooperation and complicity. To understand this connection, we must look beyond the surface. We must delve into the history, the ideology, and the shadowy networks that have fueled extremism for decades. Saudi Arabia is the birthplace of Islam. It's also home to Wahhabism, an ultra-conservative interpretation of the faith. Wahhabism has been the dominant form of Islam in Saudi Arabia for centuries. It's a rigid and intolerant ideology that views the West as the enemy. It's also the ideology that inspired Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. For decades, Saudi Arabia has exported Wahhabism around the world. It has funded mosques, schools, and Islamic centers that preach this extremist ideology. The kingdom has justified this by claiming to promote Islamic teachings and provide charity. However, critics argue that this funding has fueled the rise of radical Islam. The lines between charity and extremism have often been blurred. Saudi Arabia's vast oil wealth has allowed it to exert significant influence over the Muslim world. This influence has been used in part to spread Wahhabi ideology. While the Saudi government has taken steps to combat terrorism within its own borders, it has been accused of turning a blind eye to the activities of wealthy individuals and charities that support extremist groups abroad. And to understand the roots of Saudi Arabia's complex relationship with terrorism, one must first understand Wahhabism. This ultra-conservative interpretation of Islam, originating in 18th century Saudi Arabia, forms the bedrock of the kingdom's religious identity. Its tenets, emphasizing a strict adherence to a literal interpretation of the Quran and a rejection of any influence deemed un-Islamic, have over the years been accused of fostering an environment conducive to extremism. While Saudi Arabia has consistently maintained that Wahhabism promotes peace and spiritual purity, critics argue that its rigid doctrines, particularly those pertaining to infidels and apostates, can be interpreted as justification for violence against those deemed outside the faith. The export of this ideology, facilitated by the kingdom's immense oil wealth, began in earnest in the 1970s, reaching far beyond Saudi Arabia's borders and into the heart of Muslim communities worldwide. Mosques, madrasas, and cultural centers, generously funded by Saudi charities and individuals, became the vehicles for disseminating Wahhabi teachings across Asia, Africa, and even parts of Europe and North America. While many of these institutions undoubtedly served their communities well, providing education and religious instruction, concerns arose about the curriculum and the potential for radicalization within these Saudi-backed establishments. The rapid spread of Wahhabism, fueled by Saudi largesse, coincided with a period of growing Islamic fundamentalism globally. This confluence of events, coupled with the often murky nature of Saudi funding, made it increasingly difficult to discern where genuine religious outreach ended and the seeds of extremism were being sown. The lines, deliberately or otherwise, were becoming dangerously blurred. Central to the narrative of Saudi Arabia's intricate ties to terrorism is the question of financial flow, the movement of vast sums of money from the kingdom to various organizations and individuals across the globe. While a significant portion of this funding undoubtedly went towards legitimate charitable causes, alleviating poverty and supporting education and healthcare initiatives, a darker undercurrent began to emerge. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, as the Mujahideen battled Soviet forces in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia emerged as a crucial source of funding and logistical support for the Afghan resistance. While this initially seemed like a noble endeavor, supporting a fight against communist expansion, it also inadvertently fostered the rise of militant groups, some of whom would later go on to form the core of Al-Qaeda. This period saw the emergence of a complex web of Saudi charities and private donors channeling funds to various groups and individuals engaged in the Afghan jihad. While the Saudi government maintained that these activities were purely humanitarian, evidence began to surface suggesting that some of these funds were being diverted to extremist elements within the Mujahideen, blurring the lines between charity and complicity. The lack of transparency surrounding these financial transactions, coupled with the Saudi government's reluctance to address growing concerns about the potential misuse of charitable funds, raised alarm bells within intelligence communities worldwide. The seeds of doubt had been sown. Could Saudi Arabia, a supposed ally in the fight against terrorism, be inadvertently fueling the very extremism it claimed to oppose? Section 3. Al-Haramain, a case study in deception. The case of the Al-Haramain Islamic Foundation stands as a stark illustration of the blurred lines between charity and extremism that characterized much of Saudi Arabia's foreign funding activities. Ostensibly a humanitarian organization with branches across the globe, Al-Haramain presented a public face of piety and generosity, providing aid to those in need, particularly in conflict zones and developing countries. However, beneath this veneer of philanthropy lurked a more sinister reality. As early as the late 1990s, intelligence agencies began to uncover evidence suggesting that Al-Haramain was operating as a front for extremist groups, channeling funds and providing logistical support to organizations with links to Al-Qaeda. The Foundation's global reach, coupled with the often lax oversight of charitable organizations, made it an ideal conduit for moving money and resources to those seeking to sow chaos and terror. In 2004, the U.S. Treasury Department designated Al-Haramain a terrorist entity, accusing the Foundation of providing material support to Al-Qaeda and facilitating the movement of operatives and weapons. This designation, based on years of intelligence gathering and financial tracking, sent shockwaves through the international community. Here was a supposedly reputable charity operating openly and with the tacit approval of the Saudi government, revealed to be complicit in acts of terror. The Al-Haramain case highlighted the challenges faced by intelligence agencies in tracking the flow of money from wealthy donors and ostensibly legitimate organizations to extremist groups. It also cast a long shadow over Saudi Arabia's commitment to combating terrorism, raising uncomfortable questions about the kingdom's willingness or ability to effectively monitor and control the activities of its citizens and institutions operating abroad. Section 1. A flow of money unveiling the financial networks. The Al-Haramain scandal was just the tip of the iceberg. Behind the facade of legitimate charities, a complex and opaque network of financial flows was funneling money from Saudi Arabia to extremist organizations around the world. These weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a systemic problem, deeply embedded within the kingdom's wealthy elite and enabled by a culture of secrecy and impunity. The money flowed through various channels: Islamic charities with ties to extremist groups, wealthy Saudi donors with questionable agendas, and even front companies operating under the guise of legitimate businesses. These channels were often intertwined, making it extremely difficult to trace the origin and destination of the funds. The lack of transparency within Saudi Arabia's financial system further exacerbated the problem. Western intelligence agencies struggled to keep up with the labyrinthine money trails. The Saudis, for their part, were often uncooperative, dismissing concerns about terrorist financing as baseless accusations. This lack of cooperation fueled suspicions that the kingdom was complicit in, or at the very least turning a blind eye to the activities of its citizens. The financial networks supporting terrorism were vast and sophisticated, operating across borders and continents. They exploited legal loopholes, used shell companies and intermediaries, and often relied on the hawala system, an informal method of transferring money that leaves no paper trail. Unraveling these networks would require unprecedented international cooperation and a willingness to confront powerful individuals and institutions. Section 2. Royal Connections, the House of Saud and the Shadow of Funding. The financial networks supporting extremism didn't just operate in the shadows. They often led directly to the heart of Saudi Arabia's ruling elite. Wealthy Saudi princes, businessmen with close ties to the royal family, and even members of the government itself were implicated in funding extremist groups. These individuals operated with a level of impunity that was both shocking and revealing. One of the most prominent figures linked to terrorist financing was Prince Salman bin Abdulaziz, the former governor of Riyadh and half-brother of King Abdullah. Prince Salman, known for his charitable work, was accused of funneling millions of dollars to extremist groups operating in Chechnya, Bosnia, and Afghanistan. While he denied these allegations, evidence suggested that he used his position and influence to channel funds to groups with clear ties to terrorism. The involvement of high-ranking Saudi royals in terrorist financing raised serious questions about the nature of the kingdom's relationship with extremism. Were these isolated incidents, or did they reflect a deeper tolerance for, or even complicity with, extremist ideologies within the House of Saud? The world watched, waiting for answers that never seemed to come. The Saudi government's response to these allegations was often muted and evasive. They pointed to the kingdom's efforts to combat terrorism within its own borders, but they rarely took concrete action against powerful individuals accused of funding extremism abroad. This lack of accountability only strengthened the perception that Saudi Arabia was playing a double game. The question of the Saudi government's role in terrorist financing is a complex and contentious one. Did the kingdom actively support extremist groups, or was it simply negligent in monitoring the activities of its citizens? The evidence suggests a more nuanced and disturbing reality, a combination of deliberate obfuscation, willful ignorance, and a deep-seated fear of confronting the problem head-on. The Saudi government walked a tightrope, publicly condemning terrorism while privately turning a blind eye to the activities of those who funded it. They feared alienating powerful individuals within the kingdom, many of whom belonged to influential families or held key positions in government. They also worried about sparking a backlash from conservative elements within Saudi society, who might view any crackdown on extremist financing as an attack on Islam itself. This balancing act created a climate of impunity, where wealthy individuals and charities could funnel money to extremist groups with little fear of repercussions. The government's reluctance to address the problem stemmed from a complex web of political, economic, and social factors, making it difficult to disentangle complicity from negligence. The Saudi government's inaction had global consequences. The money flowing from the kingdom funded terrorist attacks, fueled insurgencies, and destabilized entire regions. The world watched as a country that claimed to be an ally in the fight against terrorism was, at the very least, enabling the very forces it claimed to oppose. No figure embodies the contradictions of Saudi Arabia's relationship with terrorism more than Osama bin Laden. Born into one of the kingdom's wealthiest families, bin Laden was a product of the very society that he would later turn against. His story is a cautionary tale of how a toxic mix of ideology, wealth, and political expediency can create the perfect breeding ground for extremism. Bin Laden's radicalization began in the 1980s during the Soviet-Afghan War. Like many young Saudis at the time, he was swept up in the wave of Islamic fervor that accompanied the conflict. He traveled to Afghanistan, where he fought alongside the Mujahideen, financed and supported by the Saudi government and wealthy donors. The Saudi government saw the Afghan jihad as an opportunity to counter Soviet influence in the region and bolster its own standing within the Muslim world. They poured money and resources into the conflict, often turning a blind eye to the extremist ideologies of some of the Mujahideen groups they were supporting. This short-sighted policy would have devastating consequences. Bin Laden returned from Afghanistan a changed man. He had witnessed firsthand the brutality of war and the power of religious extremism. He had also forged connections with a network of like-minded militants, many of whom would later join him in Al-Qaeda. The seeds of jihad had been sown, and they would soon bear bitter fruit. The rugged mountains and desolate plains of Afghanistan became the crucible in which Osama bin Laden, the scion of a wealthy Saudi family, transformed into a hardened militant, his heart ablaze with a fiery extremist interpretation of Islam. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 had ignited a jihad, a holy war that drew Muslims from across the globe, united in their desire to repel a foreign power from Muslim lands. Bin Laden, then a young man in his early 20s, answered the call, driven by a potent mix of religious zeal and a yearning for adventure. Afghanistan in the 1980s was a chaotic battleground awash in weapons and foreign fighters. The United States, eager to counter Soviet influence, had thrown its weight behind the Mujahideen, the Afghan resistance fighters, providing them with weapons and financial support. Saudi Arabia, a staunch U.S. ally and a key player in the Muslim world, emerged as a crucial conduit for this support, channeling funds and resources to the Afghan resistance. Amidst this volatile mix, bin Laden found his calling. He established his own training camps, attracting recruits from across the Arab world, drawn to his charisma and his message of violent jihad. The camps, funded in part by Saudi money, became breeding grounds for a new generation of militants, indoctrinated in a radical ideology that viewed the West as the enemy and advocated for the establishment of a global Islamic caliphate through violence and terror. The Afghan jihad was a turning point in bin Laden's life. It was here that he honed his military skills, forged alliances with other militants, and developed the ideology that would later underpin Al-Qaeda's reign of terror. Yet this transformation was not happening in a vacuum. It was enabled in part by the very powers that claimed to oppose extremism, the United States and its allies, including Saudi Arabia, who had unwittingly nurtured a monster in their pursuit of short-term geopolitical goals. From ally to enemy, bin Laden's rift with the Saudi kingdom. The shifting sands of geopolitics and bin Laden's own hardening ideology soon drove a wedge between him and the Saudi regime he had once defended. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in 1990, a pivotal moment in Middle Eastern history, proved to be the catalyst for this schism. When Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein threatened to push further south towards Saudi Arabia's oil-rich eastern province, the kingdom, fearing for its security, turned to the United States for protection. The arrival of American troops on Saudi soil, a land considered sacred by many Muslims, enraged bin Laden. He saw it as a desecration, a betrayal of Islam by the Saudi monarchy. His criticism of the royal family, once muted, grew increasingly strident. He accused them of corruption, of abandoning Islamic principles, and of becoming puppets of the West. In his eyes, the Saudi regime had lost its legitimacy, and he vowed to wage jihad against it. The Saudi government, caught off guard by the ferocity of bin Laden's attacks and alarmed by his growing influence, stripped him of his citizenship and froze his assets. However, this did little to curtail his activities. Bin Laden, by then, had established a network of loyal followers and a steady stream of funding, some of it allegedly from sympathetic individuals within Saudi Arabia itself. The relationship between bin Laden and the Saudi regime had become a dangerous game of cat and mouse. The kingdom, while publicly condemning bin Laden's rhetoric and actions, found itself in a difficult position. They feared alienating conservative elements within Saudi society who sympathized with bin Laden's message, while also facing mounting pressure from the international community to crack down on his terrorist network. A convenient blind eye Saudi funding amidst condemnation. The complexities of Saudi Arabia's relationship with terrorism were never more apparent than in the years following bin Laden's break with the kingdom. While the Saudi government publicly condemned Al-Qaeda and pledged to cooperate with international efforts to combat terrorism, evidence continued to surface suggesting that money from Saudi Arabia was still finding its way into the coffers of extremist groups, including, some alleged, Al-Qaeda itself. The flow of funds was often difficult to track, channeled through a labyrinthine network of charities, wealthy individuals, and front companies. Some of these entities may have been genuinely charitable, their donations unwittingly diverted to extremist causes. Others, however, may have knowingly turned a blind eye, their philanthropy masking a more sinister agenda. The Saudi government's response to these allegations was often muted and evasive. They pointed to the kingdom's efforts to combat terrorism within its borders, highlighting the arrests and prosecutions of suspected terrorists. However, they rarely took concrete action against powerful individuals or institutions accused of funding extremism abroad, fueling suspicions that the kingdom was more interested in protecting its image than in tackling the problem at its root. This climate of impunity, coupled with the often murky nature of Saudi funding, made it exceedingly difficult to hold the kingdom accountable. The United States, heavily reliant on Saudi Arabia for oil and as a strategic partner in the Middle East, was often reluctant to press the issue too forcefully, fearing a diplomatic rift with a key ally. This hesitancy, however, came at a cost, allowing the flow of money to continue, fueling the very extremism that the West claimed to oppose. A legacy of extremism, bin Laden's enduring influence. Osama bin Laden's reign of terror finally came to an end in 2011 when he was killed in a U.S. raid on his compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. His death was a major victory in the fight against Al-Qaeda, but it did not erase the legacy of extremism that he had unleashed upon the world. Bin Laden's ideology, a toxic blend of Wahhabism, anti-Western sentiment, and a thirst for violent jihad, continued to inspire a new generation of terrorists, even as his organization was weakened and fractured. Al-Qaeda, once a hierarchical organization with a global reach, has since morphed into a more diffuse and decentralized network of affiliates and offshoots inspired by bin Laden's ideology but operating with varying degrees of autonomy. These groups, from Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, Opaque, to Al-Shabaab in Somalia, have carried out numerous attacks in the years since bin Laden's death, demonstrating the enduring appeal of his message of hate and violence. Bin Laden's legacy is a stark reminder of the enduring power of ideology and the challenges of combating extremism in the 21st century. While military force can degrade terrorist organizations, it cannot eradicate the underlying grievances, ideologies, and narratives that fuel them. Addressing these root causes requires a long-term, multifaceted approach that goes beyond military intervention and intelligence gathering. It requires addressing issues of poverty, inequality, and political disenfranchisement that create fertile ground for extremist recruitment. It requires countering extremist propaganda and providing alternative narratives that offer hope and opportunity. And it requires holding states accountable for their role in enabling extremism, whether through direct support, willful ignorance, or a failure to address the root causes of radicalization within their own societies. In the years following the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. government launched a massive investigation into the events leading up to that tragic day. The 9/11 Commission report, a product of this exhaustive inquiry, became the definitive account of the attacks, detailing the hijackers' movements, motivations, and the intelligence failures that allowed the tragedy to unfold. Yet a shadow of suspicion lingered, fueled by whispers of a cover-up, of uncomfortable truths hidden from public view. At the heart of this controversy lay a 28-page section of the report, shrouded in secrecy and redacted from the public version. These pages, it was rumored, contained explosive information about possible foreign government support for the hijackers, with Saudi Arabia at the center of these allegations. For years, the 28 pages became a source of intense speculation and intrigue, a symbol of a potential conspiracy reaching the highest levels of power. The pressure to declassify the 28 pages mounted steadily, fueled by the families of 9/11 victims, lawmakers, and journalists demanding transparency and accountability. Finally, in 2016, after years of resistance from both the Bush and Obama administrations, the 28 pages were released to the public. While they did not contain a smoking gun directly implicating the Saudi government in the 9/11 plot, the pages painted a troubling picture of connections between Saudi officials, intelligence operatives, and individuals who provided logistical and financial support to the hijackers. The release of the 28 pages, while a victory for transparency, did little to quell the controversy surrounding Saudi Arabia's role in the events leading up to 9/11. Critics argued that the redactions, while necessary to protect intelligence sources and methods, also served to obscure the full extent of Saudi involvement. The debate over the 28 pages and the questions they raised about potential Saudi complicity continued to cast a long shadow over U.S. Saudi relations, a stark reminder of the unresolved issues that lingered beneath the surface of this strategic but often uneasy alliance. The 28 pages, while heavily redacted, provided tantalizing glimpses into the movements and connections of the 9/11 hijackers in the months leading up to the attacks. One name in particular stood out: Omar Al-Bayoumi, a Saudi national living in San Diego, California. Bayoumi, according to the report, had ties to the Saudi government and had interacted with two of the hijackers, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midar, shortly after their arrival in the United States. The nature and extent of Bayoumi's relationship with the hijackers remain a subject of intense debate. Some investigators believe that he was merely a well-connected Saudi national who provided assistance to his countrymen, unaware of their sinister intentions. Others, however, view his actions as more suspicious, pointing to his ties to Saudi intelligence and his seemingly orchestrated encounters with Hazmi and Miqdar as evidence of a more nefarious role. The 28 pages revealed that Bayoumi had arranged for Hazmi and Miqdar to rent an apartment in San Diego, and had even co-signed their lease. He had also introduced them to members of the local Muslim community, some of whom provided the hijackers with financial assistance and helped them enroll in flight schools. While these actions could be interpreted as those of a generous and hospitable individual, they raised red flags for investigators trying to piece together the hijackers' support network in the United States. Bayoumi left the United States shortly before the 9/11 attacks and was never charged with any crime related to the plot. He maintained his innocence, claiming that his interactions with the hijackers were purely coincidental. However, the circumstances surrounding his relationship with Hazmi and Miqdar, coupled with his connections to the Saudi government, continue to fuel speculation about his possible involvement in the events leading up to 9/11. The revelations contained within the 28 pages, while far from conclusive, ignited a firestorm of controversy, raising uncomfortable questions about the extent to which U.S. officials may have downplayed or even suppressed evidence of Saudi involvement in the 9/11 attacks. Critics accused successive administrations, both Republican and Democrat, of prioritizing strategic interests over truth and justice, shielding a key ally from scrutiny, even as evidence mounted of the kingdom's role in enabling the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil. The reasons for this alleged cover-up, according to critics, were complex and multifaceted. Saudi Arabia, a major oil producer and a crucial player in the volatile Middle East, held immense strategic importance for the United States. Maintaining close ties with the kingdom was seen as essential for ensuring regional stability, combating terrorism, and securing access to vital energy resources. Furthermore, the U.S. government relied heavily on Saudi intelligence cooperation in the fight against Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. Alienating the Saudis by aggressively pursuing investigations into their possible involvement in 9/11, it was argued, would jeopardize this cooperation and undermine efforts to prevent future attacks. The decision to classify the 28 pages and resist their release for so many years, whether motivated by a desire to protect a strategic ally or to obscure uncomfortable truths, had a corrosive effect on public trust. It fueled conspiracy theories, eroded confidence in government institutions, and left a lingering sense that justice had not been fully served. The 28 pages, a symbol of secrecy and potential complicity, served as a constant reminder of the complex and often murky realities that underpin international relations, where strategic interests and moral imperatives often collide. The United States, in the aftermath of 9/11, found itself wrestling with a moral and strategic dilemma. On one hand, the evidence, though circumstantial, pointed towards a potential Saudi connection to the attacks, a betrayal of trust that demanded accountability. On the other hand, Saudi Arabia, the world's oil superpower, held the key to global energy stability, a vital interest for a nation heavily reliant on foreign oil. The U.S. economy, heavily reliant on a steady supply of affordable oil, could ill afford a disruption in Saudi oil production. The kingdom, acutely aware of its leverage, had wielded the oil weapon in the past, most notably during the 1973 oil embargo, which had sent shockwaves through the global economy. Any attempt to hold Saudi Arabia accountable for its alleged role in 9/11, it was feared, could trigger a similar crisis. The Bush administration, grappling with the economic fallout of the 9/11 attacks and facing a looming war in Iraq, another major oil producer, opted for a pragmatic approach. Publicly, they reaffirmed the U.S. Saudi alliance, emphasizing the kingdom's cooperation in the fight against terrorism. Privately, however, concerns lingered about the potential consequences of pushing too hard on the issue of Saudi involvement in 9/11. This balancing act, a delicate dance between moral outrage and strategic necessity, came to be known as the oil factor. It was a tacit acknowledgement that geopolitical interests, particularly those related to energy security, often trumped concerns about human rights, accountability, and even, some argued, justice for the victims of 9/11. This Faustian bargain, struck in the shadow of a national tragedy, would have far-reaching consequences, shaping U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for years to come. Section 2, Intelligence Ties Walking a Tightrope. The United States-Saudi relationship, while often strained by the weight of history and conflicting interests, rested on a foundation of shared security concerns, particularly in the realm of intelligence sharing. Saudi Arabia, with its vast network of informants and its strategic location in the heart of the Middle East, was seen as a crucial ally in the fight against terrorism, particularly in the aftermath of 9/11. The CIA and its Saudi counterpart, the General Intelligence Presidency, or GIP, had a long history of cooperation, dating back to the Cold War. This collaboration had deepened in the 1990s, as both countries grappled with the rise of Al-Qaeda and other extremist groups. The Saudis, with their intimate knowledge of the region and their access to key figures within the jihadist movement, were seen as invaluable partners in tracking and disrupting terrorist plots. The 9/11 attacks, however, had exposed the limitations of this intelligence partnership, raising questions about the depth and sincerity of Saudi cooperation. The fact that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi nationals and that some had received support from individuals with ties to the Saudi government suggested that elements within the kingdom were either complicit in the attacks or, at the very least, turning a blind eye to the activities of extremists within their midst. The United States, while acknowledging these concerns, was reluctant to jeopardize this vital intelligence relationship by pushing too aggressively on the issue of Saudi involvement in 9/11. They needed the Saudis to continue providing information on Al-Qaeda's movements, finances, and recruitment networks, particularly as the United States prepared for a full-scale invasion of Iraq, a move that many feared would further destabilize the region and embolden extremist groups. Section 3, A Costly Alliance, The Price of Silence. The decision to prioritize strategic interests over a full accounting of Saudi Arabia's role in 9/11 came at a cost, both moral and strategic. The families of 9/11 victims seeking justice and closure felt betrayed by a government that seemed more interested in protecting a foreign ally than in uncovering the truth. The perception of a cover-up fueled by years of secrecy surrounding the 28 pages and the lack of accountability for those within the Saudi government who may have aided the hijackers eroded public trust and sowed the seeds of cynicism about the United States government's motives in the Middle East. The long-term strategic implications of this Faustian bargain were even more profound. The United States, by shielding Saudi Arabia from scrutiny and accountability, emboldened the kingdom's rulers who continued to export their Wahhabist ideology and to turn a blind eye to the activities of wealthy individuals and charities within their borders that funded extremist groups abroad. This, in turn, fueled the very extremism that the United States was trying to combat, creating a vicious cycle of violence and instability. The United States, in its pursuit of stability and energy security, had become entangled in a web of contradictions. They were allied with a regime that, while publicly condemning terrorism, continued to nurture the very ideology that fueled it. They were dependent on a country whose vast oil wealth gave it outsized influence, allowing it to act with impunity even as its actions undermined United States interests in the region, and they were complicit through their silence and inaction in perpetuating a system that prioritized short-term gains over long-term solutions, leaving a legacy of unresolved grievances, mistrust, and instability in its wake. Section 1. A Kingdom Divided. Saudi Arabia stands at a crossroads, its international image tarnished by the specter of terrorism and its internal contradictions laid bare. The kingdom's leaders, caught between the forces of modernization and the weight of tradition, face a stark choice: confront the legacy of extremism they have nurtured for decades, or risk being consumed by the very forces they have sought to control. The Saudi people, particularly the younger generation, yearn for change. They have witnessed the devastation wrought by extremism, both at home and abroad. They are connected to the wider world through social media and globalized culture, and they are no longer content with the rigid restrictions and insular worldview that have defined their society for generations. Yet resistance to change runs deep within the kingdom. The religious establishment, the guardian of Wahhabist doctrine, wields considerable power and influence. They view any attempt to reform Islam or challenge their authority as a threat to the very foundations of Saudi society. The royal family, divided by internal rivalries and wary of upsetting the delicate balance of power, has often been reluctant to confront the religious establishment or to embrace meaningful reforms. Saudi Arabia's future hangs in the balance. The kingdom can choose to cling to the past, to deny its role in fostering extremism, and to resist the tide of change sweeping the region. Or it can choose to embrace a new path, one that acknowledges past mistakes, confronts extremism head-on, and empowers its people to build a more just and tolerant society. The world watches, waiting to see which path the kingdom will choose. Section 2. The World Watching. The world has a stake in Saudi Arabia's choices. The kingdom's vast oil reserves, its strategic location in the heart of the Middle East, and its influence within the Muslim world give it an outsized role in shaping global events. The world cannot afford for Saudi Arabia to remain a breeding ground for extremism, a source of instability, and a drag on progress. The United States, long Saudi Arabia's most important ally, bears a special responsibility. For decades, the United States has prioritized its strategic interests over its values, turning a blind eye to Saudi Arabia's human rights abuses, its suppression of dissent, and its role in fueling extremism. This Faustian bargain has come at a steep price, undermining United States credibility, fueling anti-American sentiment, and creating a climate of impunity that has allowed extremism to flourish. The United States must chart a new course, one that prioritizes human rights, promotes democracy, and holds its allies accountable. This will require a fundamental shift in thinking, a recognition that true security lies not in propping up autocratic regimes, but in supporting the aspirations of people for freedom, justice, and opportunity. The world is watching, waiting to see if the United States has learned from its past mistakes. The time for complacency is over. The stakes are too high. The future, not just of Saudi Arabia, but of the entire region, may depend on the choices made in the years to come.